Modern Naughty Dog games are well known for being very serious, heavily story-driven, narrative games, to the point where some people basically consider their games to be interactive movies. But if you look at the games they were making 20 or so years ago, or even just a little bit more recent, you'll notice that they're very, very different. The Naughty Dog games of the past were all platformers with bright, cheery environments, cartoon-like characters full of little jokes and gags. And, of course, you have the games today, games like Uncharted 4, Last of Us, much more serious adventures, narrative-driven, story-driven, great acting, great character development. And there's a clear divide between their old games with those bright, cheery, cartoony platformers and their new games from the PS3 going forward with these heavier, darker, more story-driven themes and third-person shooter gameplay. But the change from cartoony platformers to gritty, realistic, story-driven, mature games wasn't as sudden as you might think. Yes, the change in platforms from PlayStation 2 to PlayStation 3 was a big part of why Uncharted came out the way it did, but I believe that the start of Naughty Dog's transformation into the company that we know today started much earlier than the dawn of Sony's 7th gen console, the PlayStation 3. Personally, I believe that Jak 2 was the first big step down the road that slowly led to the Naughty Dog that we have today. At the time, Jak 2 was seen as a huge change of pace for Naughty Dog. Like I said, their games had mostly been straight platformers up until this point, with bright, cheery, colorful themes, and Jak 2 introduced a lot more action to the formula. The platforming is still there, of course, but there's so many other elements added to it. Guns, racing, missions, lots of little side things, and an overall larger focus on combat was also present here. These are big things that people usually focus on when they look at Jak 2 compared to the previous Naughty Dog games. But in my opinion, what actually makes this game interesting, and the reason why I believe that this game is the first step in the path to games like Uncharted and The Last of Us, is that Jak 2 introduced a much heavier focus on story, character, narratives, and mature content compared to previous Naughty Dog games. Now, look, I don't think the story of previous Naughty Dog games were bad, not at all. They were pretty good, but let's be honest, they weren't the forefront of the game. These games, Jak and Daxter's Precursor Legacy or any of the Crash Bandicoot games were not story-driven games. The story was there, but it was more about the gameplay. And that's not to say that Jak 2 is completely story-driven, but with the Jak 2, the player immediately, from the moment the game starts, they get thrown into a highly convoluted plot involving decades-long war, betrayal, and time travel. I mean, that's a big step up from Crash Bandicoot getting tricked into helping Cortex. The story feels like it has real stakes to it. There's a level of darkness, maturity, and emotion to this game and its plot that wasn't seen in previous Naughty Dog games. I mean, okay, it's not The Last of Us, but I mean, come on, look at this game compared to Jak and Daxter, the original. There's a big divide here. And the complex plot is really only part of the equation here. A big difference that you're going to notice in this game compared to Naughty Dog's previous ones is just how many side characters there are and how much development they all get. This game has a pretty big cast of side characters that you meet, and many of them get to be seen multiple times and have a lot of development and a lot of dialogue. That's not to say there weren't other characters in previous Naughty Dog games, of course there were, but there weren't quite as many and they weren't quite as fleshed out in my opinion. Every character in Jak 2 feels alive. They've got motivations, personalities, and great voice acting. We get a lot more screen time and dialogue with these characters in Jak 2, and they get a lot more development compared to characters in previous Naughty Dog games. And the same goes for the titular character, Jak. In the first game, he was a mute, and he didn't contribute a whole lot character-wise to the game. I mean, that's not to say he didn't have his own personality or things going on. He did have a little bit of that, but he was mostly a blank slate. And I mean, come on, like, he was a mute for God's sake. There's only so much Naughty Dog could do with him. Compare that to, say, Jak 2, where not only can Jak talk now, but he is pissed. I mean, this guy is full of attitude. I mean, he is freaking angry. There's a lot of hot-headed anger and darkness in this character, and Naughty Dog does a good job of making Jak into a tough and kind of rough around the edges, but at the same time cool and strangely charismatic character. He is really loaded with personality, and it makes him to be quite a likable character despite being a bit hot-headed, much like the other characters in this game, which are also filled with personality, and each one plays an important job within the story. And speaking of which, this game, once again, has a much more mature, darker, edgier approach than anything that Naughty Dog made before. Once again, it's not The Last of Us. It's not an M-rated game. You're not blowing people's heads off here. It's not completely grown up. It's still got plenty of gags and jokes and moments of levity, but this game's tone did have a lot more serious tinge to it and was a big departure compared to Naughty Dog's previous titles, much like the gameplay. I mean, look at Dark Jack. If that isn't a perfect representation for what this game represented, I don't know what else is. I mean, this game had some cursing, it had a lot more violence, and like I said before, the main character, Jack, is just a really dark, angry, edgy dude in this game. The story had stakes to it, the narrative had a lot more emotion. This platformer stood out from all the others with its wonderful cast of characters. Once again, I know I said this 3 times or whatever, it's not The Last of Us, sure, but the more I look at it, the more obvious it becomes that this is where all those things started from. This is the branching point. This is the point where Naughty Dog said, okay, you know what? Let's give it a bit more story. Let's give it some more characters. Let's change things up. Let's make it a little bit darker. Guess what? It paid off. This was the first time Naughty Dog treated their games very seriously. And the thing is, like I said, it paid off. Jak 2 was really well received at launch, and not just because of the fresh gameplay. Critics really enjoyed the story and how fleshed out the characters were in this game. They praised the maturity, the weight, and the emotion of the story, and the rather surprising plot twists that get thrown in as well. And of course, there were some people who criticized the game for being too dark or edgy or too much of a departure from previous games, and some people complained about the difficulty. But overall, people did really love it. It was well received, and I don't think it's an accident that most of Naughty Dog's games going forward would have a similar or even greater emphasis on story and characters. Jak 3 also had a big emphasis on story and character development, and of course with the next generation, Naughty Dog began to really take shape into what we see today. Naughty Dog took a lot of risks with Jak 2, making both changes to the gameplay and the overall tone of the game, and it really did pay off. In fact, I think you can actually draw a lot of parallels to the original Uncharted game. The original Uncharted game was also a game where Naughty Dog was making a huge departure from what they were known for and delved even deeper into the story and third-person shooter gameplay aspects. And much like with Jak 2, it paid off once again. And, yet again, Naughty Dog made another jump forward, another evolution with The Last of Us, making an even darker, grim, and gripping story that is seen as one of the best story-driven games of all time. And I do think all this really can be traced back to Jak 2, where Naughty Dog decided to kind of dip their toe into the big boy pool. They decided to just say, hey, you know what? We're gonna make a game, it's got more story, it's got more characters, it's bigger, it's better, it's darker, it's edgier. And they have now done this several times, like I explained. These games were no longer all just about cartoon characters and collecting arbitrary power sources anymore. It was about anger and revenge and war and resistance and destiny and interpersonal relationships and all sorts of stuff. Jak 2 really brought a lot to the table. And I know there's always going to be detractors who complain about how Naughty Dog ripped off the mission style from GTA, and okay, look, I can't really defend that, you know, they're right, they kind of did rip off the mission style, okay, they did, but, you know what, that is not the focus. There is so much more to this game than just that. The thing that people overlook with this game is the depth and complexity of the story and the characters within it. I think it's somewhat understated. It's subtle. I think the thing is, people get so shocked by how much different the gameplay is compared to the previous game in this series that they don't really notice just how, like, wacky the story is and how much more they put into the story for this game. I mean, honestly, like, I made a video a while ago talking about the big bad guys of this game, the metalheads, and where the hell do they come from, what the hell do they have to do with the story, and it's a ridiculous video. It's super complex and just insane, and that's just one example of how complex this game is. And the thing is, Naughty Dog created a living, breathing world with Jak 2, and its more serious tones keep things a bit more grounded feeling than previous games. Once again, there's levity, there's still jokes and gags and whatnot, it's still cartoony. But the thing is, it has these darker undertones that keep it a bit more grounded. The game feels more serious, the story feels more serious, you can feel the struggle and the fight in these characters, and it makes the world pop. The more I look at it, the easier it is to see that this game is definitely the precursor, pun intended, for the games by Naughty Dog that came later. This was the blueprint, this was the starting point, and they just ramped things up from here until they got to the point where they are today. Jak 2 was truly a paradigm shift for Naughty Dog, and it also happens to be one of my favorite games. That's all I really had to say about this topic. So, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more classic video game content coming soon.